And hello, everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Oh, in true Zoom fashion, it's decided to ignore where that is. So 2 seconds. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see that? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so yes, I'm Dr Justine Reilly. I run an organisation that is called the Neurodiverse Museum. And the aim of the Neurodiverse Museum is to try and support organisations working within the cultural heritage sector to better understand about neurodiversity as a whole, but particularly neurodivergent individuals, and how to support them across all of the things that they do, whether that be within accessing their services, part of their workforce, or the representation of neurodivergent people. So everything that I'll be talking about comes from that kind of background. Our initial session talked about very much around the specifics about what it is to be neurodivergent. I want to touch a little bit about that at the start of this session, because sometimes people say, well, actually all the time people say the terminology is the bit that they really find interesting and sometimes struggle with. So we'll look at that really quickly before we go into the rest of the session, just so that we've touched on some of that. So we'll look at the different terminologies, clinical deficit language, identity first languages, and then how we can think about barrier removing. So I find this is quite a useful slide that starts to talk about the different terminologies that you might hear about in terms of neurodiversity. So yeah, the whole term neurodiversity is that natural diversity of human brains. So the fact that we all have different functioning brains. Then there's the philosophy of neurodiversity. So people starting to say, oh, hang on a minute, all our brains don't work the same. The movement of neurodiversity that is trying to say, hang on, actually neurodivergent people are as important as neurotypical people. Let's start thinking about that and making sure that there's some equitable experiences going on. And then the bits that you might hear the most, neurodivergent, so somebody whose brain is different from what is considered to be the norm. And somebody can't be neurodiverse in terms of grammatical approach. Somebody is neurodivergent. A population would be neurodiverse, so they would have neurotypical brains and neurodivergent brains, but a person is neurodivergent. And neurotypical, somebody whose brain is considered to be the normal, or as we're hearing more and more people calling, neuromajority. So yeah, a neurodiverse is that whole kind of population. But if you had a group of people who are all autistic, that would be a neurodivergent group. So neurodivergence includes, but isn't limited to, the different kinds of terms that you see here: autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, I won't name them all, but lots of different conditions and different ways that people's brains work are included within the term neurodivergence. We will share these slides, I think, won't we? So we don't need to take everything down. And then we function on the model of the social model of disability. What we still find within the cultural sector and within the education sector is that still there's a potential for people to lean towards the medical model of disability, that it's the person that needs to shift or change to be able to access services, rather than the social model of disability, which is actually the barriers of what is going on around the person. We need to shift and change those and make adjustments to those so that there's an equitable experience. And you'll hear me talk about equity throughout. I don't tend to use the words inclusion or equality, because I think we're starting as a society to use them lazily, where we're saying, oh, well, we've thought about inclusion, so therefore we've done enough. So we talk a lot about equity and what is the equitable experience for neurodivergent people. So this is where our first poll comes in. So I'm going to see if I can make sure I can see Danny. Okay. So do I need to remove my screen share, Danny, so that you can put the poll up? No, brilliant. So the first poll, this is where I want to try and understand whereabouts everybody in the Zoom room is in terms of reasonable adjustments and the law that underpins that before we go into that next section. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, have you heard of reasonable adjustments? So there we go, there's the poll. So you just need to click on it, yes or no. Brilliant. Brilliant, thank you. And is that everybody? I think everybody's popped. Okay.
Mine is saying that I don't have any responses, so...
Oh, okay, so I can see the responses. So we have 12 people who said yes and 1 person who said no.
Okay.
Can you, are they being shared? Can everybody see them? No. I can just see them all shared, you see.
Yeah, okay. I'm getting nods from people. It looks like...
I can see them and I've got the button that says stop sharing. So maybe it's to me to remove.
It looks like it's just me and Sarah that can't see them, which is fine. We don't need to. As long as everyone else can, that's great.
Brilliant. Okay, that's fantastic. And then the next question I want to ask you is this. So, do you know what the underpinning law is which requires reasonable adjustments in any and all organisations, including cultural and education settings? It's quite a big question, but basically, do you know what the law is that says reasonable adjustments should be put into place? So there's that poll. There it comes. Oh, it's a fight on this one. We're nearly there. Can you still not see it, Danny? Okay, I think we're probably there because it's probably asking for me to do it as well. So for this one, we have 5 people say yes, they do, and 7 people who say no, they don't. I think you can all see that because I've got a stop sharing button. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. So that is what we usually see. People have heard of reasonable adjustments, but they're not so sure about what the impetus is for putting reasonable adjustments in place and where it comes from. So that's why we tend to then look at the Equalities Act 2010 and to think about, okay, so what is that underpinning? Why do we need to do it? So it applies to our sector in the same way as any other institution and organisation. And it's a legal duty to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen to people who have protected characteristics. And protected characteristics, which are written within the Equality Act, include disabled people and neurodivergent people who fit the definition of disability. So neurodivergent people aren't specifically mentioned within the Equality Act, but disabled people are, and neurodivergent people are often either class themselves as disabled or would fit within that definition. So what constitutes a disability within the Equality Act? So a substantial, more than minor or trivial, long-term, more than a year, physical or mental impairment which impacts on an individual's ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. It's quite old-fashioned language because it's from 13 years ago, but it's basically saying that it's a long-term and more than trivial that constitutes disability. And so many neurodivergent people are therefore defined as disabled. And I tested it out in a tribunal myself around the Disability Act and the fact that somebody was being discriminated against within a school environment because they were neurodivergent, and it absolutely was classed as essential to the Equality Act that person came under the protected characteristic of being a disabled person. So it's something to be really, really aware of, that neurodivergent people absolutely fit within the Equality Act. And so that need to look at the reasonable adjustments is crucial, particularly for any public organisation. So how is direct discrimination and indirect discrimination outlined within the Act? So direct discrimination is, as you'd expect, treating a disabled person less favourably because they are disabled. So being specifically, you can't do this because you are autistic. Indirect discrimination is those more blanket policies. So an organisation, for example, everybody must be here at 9 o'clock. You cannot be late. If you're late, this will happen. Well, that's a blanket policy that can discriminate against somebody who's neurodivergent because it might not be possible for them to be there at that time, potentially because it's really busy and it's a really difficult thing to be there at the same time as everybody else. So making reasonable adjustments around blanket policies are really important. And then harassment is also obviously within the outline of discrimination. And so harassment is central to something that should not be happening. We don't tend to talk about that so much because people tend to be really clear of actually, of course, that is not acceptable. But sometimes you still see some of those things happening. For an example, infantilizing neurodivergent adults. I just asked a public organisation who was delivering a specific event for SEN children, but adults supporting SEN children, who will probably largely be neurodivergent, whether they are aware of that or not themselves, because we're pretty sure it's genetic. And I said to them, what kind of reasonable adjustments do you have in place? And they asked, oh, what would you like? And I said, well, something like a visual walkthrough would be amazing. And they came back and said, all right, we're going to do a social story. Social stories are really difficult for neurodivergent people anyway, just because of where it comes from and what they're trying to do, which is sometimes trying to shift neurodivergent people to become neurotypical people, which is an absolute no-no. But saying to a 48-year-old adult who runs their own business, we're going to do a social story, it's a bit difficult. And I think there's a real need for organisations to start thinking about how they are presenting and talking to neurodivergent people, because it could start to come into some of the things that we really don't want them to talk about in terms of the Equality Act. So reasonable adjustments themselves, I should say I'm an autistic adult myself, but did not know that until about 7 or 8 years ago. So, and I think that's happened to quite a lot of particularly women when they come to a certain age of realising what's happening. So reasonable adjustments. A reasonable adjustment itself is written within the Equality Act, that this should be something that happens where an organisation does something that might put a disabled person at a substantial advantage compared with somebody who isn't disabled, and that organisation should take a reasonable step to avoid that disadvantage. So it doesn't mean they should spend lots of time or lots of money doing something. It means it should be reasonable for that organisation or what that organisation could be expected to do. And it's referred to as the reasonable adjustments duty. So what are reasonable adjustments? So you've all heard about them and you're all probably putting them into place within your organisations already, but they're anticipatory. So it requires the organisation to think ahead and to think about what adjustments they can put into place to remove that discrimination. We see a lot of, like I was asked then, well, what do you want? And it's like, oh, it's kind of not the point. It should be about the organisation thinking, what can we do that would support people just generally as our organisation? So something like a visual walkthrough is really important. If you can just even take a mobile phone through a venue that says, right, this is what happens when you get here. This is what you will experience when you get into the venue, what you'll see. And this is where you'll go when you first get here. So important. If you can see that on a website beforehand, to actually be able to experience, go, okay, I can visualize and know what's going to happen when I get there. And it doesn't cost any money and it's quite straightforward to do. A quiet space, making sure there's a space where if it's really difficult within any kind of situation that you can just take yourself to and it's nice and quiet, just having those kind of things already in place, making it really, really clear, either through your website or through any kind of discussions that you have with any organisations that are coming onto site. So important. We see it within schools quite frequently as well, that the anticipatory duty is not there. There's a real will to change and to put reasonable adjustments in place, but they're not anticipated. So the child will go through a lot of trauma before the adjustment is put in place, which will often then mean that actually accessing that provision is really difficult. Whereas if the anticipatory duty, look advance, what's happening during the next year? What can we anticipate that is going to be tricky for our neurodivergent population? What can we do? What can we put in place? Right, let's do those things, put those in place. And then any additional things that need to happen for specific children, because we're all individuals, we can do that as and when we need to. So the things that can be put into place in terms of reasonable adjustments could be a whole mindset shift in terms of an organisation. So it's starting to think more about neurodivergent people and their needs. It can be things like provision of auxiliary aids, things like ear defenders, pen readers, that just start to make things a little bit more accessible. I know it can be removing physical barriers that make it impossible for people to be able to participate in what you do. And under the Equality Act, there's no justification for failing to make a reasonable adjustment. So I hear it a lot where people say, we didn't mean to, oh, we didn't know, oh, we didn't think that would be a problem. And none of those things are an acceptable justification. So it's really important to be thinking all the way through, what can we do? And to be able to demonstrate that you've thought about it, because then you're not needing to make a justification. You can be saying, well, we've thought about all of these things And it might not have been perfect, but we have thought and we've done everything that we can through this process. And we'll talk later about how you do that and how you think about putting those reasonable adjustments in place and who you talk to make sure that you're doing that. And so it means
Justine, sorry, there's a really quick question in the chat,
Yep.
which would be good to address right now, which is just a really simple one. What's a pen reader?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll talk about it in a bit more in depth. So for a lot of dyslexic people, it can be really difficult to read at speed and take the information in. So you can use a pen reader to just scan over the text and it reads it to you. So if you had an exhibition and you had pen readers within a cultural or heritage space, you can use the pen reader, have those on stand for dyslexic guests to come and use, and they can scan and use those pens. I went round a venue with a dyslexic person and they were like, there's just so much text, it's impossible. And actually when we talk about, and we discussed this quite a lot in the other session, but when we talk about neurodivergent people, we actually, particularly in the cultural heritage sector, are still very much thinking about autistic people, if at all. And we're thinking about autistic people in a stereotypical way. So we're thinking that they want quiet hours when actually most of us don't. And we're thinking that we need to exclude them more when actually that's not what we want. But we're not thinking about all the other neurodivergent people as well and what they need. So yeah, pen readers in terms of just making that a little bit more accessible. And they're not hugely expensive and they do make a massive difference. They could be plugged into earphones as well. Yeah, so I hope that answered the question. About what they are. So yes, this means it's irrelevant whether discrimination was intentional or not, because there's no justification for failing to make that reasonable adjustment and demonstrating that it's reasonable. You know, there might be an adjustment that could be made, but actually it's not reasonable for your organisation because it would cost too much, or it would be to take too much time for your organisation to have been able to do it. So yeah, if an organisation can't demonstrate that they've done those things, then they are putting themselves at a little bit of risk, because somebody could come along and say, actually, you should have done this. And there are potentially quite big implications. And disabled people don't need to be grateful that they've not been discriminated against, and that these things have been put into place, and that they should just happen. Sometimes there are instances where you feel that you shouldn't be asking for these things. You've become a nuisance because you're asking for these things, or even worse, you're ignored, just totally blanked, and nobody comes back and even says, "Oh, so what? You know, what might work?" Even starting that conversation is better than just not having the conversation about what could work. But yeah, definitely, there doesn't need to be any kind of, this should be just happening. Not because it's in law, but because it should be happening as something we should be doing in society. So yeah, sorry about the blurry image, but yeah, I kind of use this to represent equality and equity. We talk a lot about equality, but actually what we're looking for is equity. We're looking for the experience to be provided that allows neurodivergent people to have an equitable experience. And an example that I'll often use for this is that in application processes, things like having the questions in advance is absolutely crucial for neurodivergent people. And when I say in advance, I don't mean like an hour before. I mean, like when you say you've got an interview, here are the questions. It's so important. And it makes the difference between that neurodivergent person being able to access an interview and not. So often people will say, but that disadvantages people who haven't got the questions. Well, it doesn't, because it's just providing that kind of additional support for neurodivergent people, and give everyone the questions. When it's what we do as an organisation, when we say you've got an interview, here are the questions, and everybody has them. It's very equitable for everybody, but it makes the difference for people who might have found that difficult otherwise. And I worked with quite a big national organisation a couple of weeks ago who said, well, we can't give them more than 40 minutes advance. It wouldn't be fair. It's like, why wouldn't it? Explain why it wouldn't. And they couldn't. And eventually they did give them a sensible time in advance. So how do we know what reasonable adjustments are needed? So whole population anticipatory adjustments are the things that we've been talking about around. So visual guides, things that you can put into place that you can assume that would make a big difference to most neurodivergent people on one level or another. And will probably support some neurotypical people as well. So things like having those safe spaces, and we'll talk about the specifics a little bit later, but that whole population, things that you can do in advance that you know are going to support. But then it's also crucial to understand individual needs. So if you're working with an individual group of neurodivergent people, or you've got an individual student who's neurodivergent, it's really important to understand that child's needs. And what I see quite frequently is a bit of a hodgepodge of understanding those needs. There might be a kind of clinical diagnosis that can support, and there's a report that will help. Those are really brilliant to have in place and to kind of go, okay, that's great. Let's see how we can use those to support. But I was working with a parent yesterday whose child had not been diagnosed as situationally non-speaking, which you might hear as selective mutism or selective or situational mutism, where it's impossible to speak. You just cannot speak in certain instances. And I was that as a child. And it's not a choice, you just can't do it. And because that hadn't happened, I was chatting to the parent and saying, the things that you've said seem like that's what's going on here. So that's absolutely what's happening here. But the child's EHCP was saying, this child will say this child by the end of the year will be able to say that. Well, they were absolutely not going to be able to do those things because their profile had not been understood right at the start. And if you're working with a group of, maybe a school group is coming in or a class is coming in to work with you and it has neurodivergent children, it's a really good idea to ask, first of all, do you have any neurodivergent children within your class? And then secondly, what are their needs and how can we support? Because the worst thing in the world for a neurodivergent child who's, first of all, they're coming out on a school class visit, which is really difficult, can be really difficult. Secondly, they're working with an adult that they don't know who might ask them questions in a difficult situation that will make it even more awkward and just impossible for them to be there. And the anxiety will go through the roof and they won't want to do it again. So asking those questions about, do you have that? What kind of profile do they have? And then how can we support is absolutely essential. And these all impact on that individual's ability to take part and to process the information and make sense of it and use it. So if you've got a really, really anxious child who's coming because they don't know what to expect or what to experience, they're not going to have a good time when they're there with you, and they're probably not going to be able to make sense of what you're telling them. And having issues in these areas isn't a weakness. It's just not knowing that they exist and catering for them that's the main problem. So breakout rooms, before we go into detail about specific reasonable adjustments, I've put 15 minutes. I think we still have time for that. That's okay. So just 2 questions within the breakout room. And if anyone wants to keep cameras off and audio off because it's too intense, please do. But yeah, how would you know that someone in your classroom or with your organisation needed adjustments? And what would you do once you've understood that there's a need? So Danny, I think those questions might be put in chat. Yay, thank you. So they're there for your reference. And yeah, just beforehand, we'll send a thing saying that you'll head back into the group. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I hope that was okay. We're deep in conversations by the sounds of it. It'd be really good to get some feedback from the groups, if that's okay. If anyone feels like they're comfortable to report back from their group about what you discussed for both of the questions, how would you know that someone in your organisation or classroom needed adjustments, and what you do once you've understood there's a need? Please raise your hand now. Aha, Katie. Hi, Katie.
Hello, hi. So I think I was in group 1. So we talked about different ways that we would know would be, there's different things because we've got school trips and things like that. You would ask the question beforehand to the teachers if there was anyone who would need any reasonable adjustments. Then we also talked about public events where you might not be privy to that kind of information. So we just discussed maybe like things like memberships where you do kind of gather more information of people. So you kind of have that to hand. And then it was also about having things available, like readily available as well. I suppose is this the next question? And
that's okay. You can go for both of it. Yes.
Is having things available, like things like ear defenders, having like breakout spaces available that people don't have to ask for them. So they're just kind of, they're there at reception, they can just pick them up, or, you know, they're kind of, they're not putting that barrier in. We talked about what we would do once you did have what would you do? The second question. What would you do once you understand there's a need?
Once you know there's a need,
yeah. Is asking, kind of maybe asking them what reasonable adjustments you need that you would do in an interview. Also, we thought about maybe doing like a mail survey out to people. And asking them then, like, what adjustments would you require, just so we kind of cover more bases. And then once every time we do discuss, like we encounter someone with an additional need that we haven't known about, making it transmittable and it's kind of built into our everyday offer, to make it a more equitable, I can't say the word, equitable experience role. So just like, so it's just built in, like now, the mobility disability, that's kind of, you can have ramps, you have accessible toilets, that's just kind of, it's standard. So this should kind of be a standard, and it's kind of building that into everything we do, really.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And that kind of learning and going, okay, well, we can do this, so let's just build this into something that is an offer all the time. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Is there anyone from the other group that would like to respond? I can't see everybody in one place, so you're welcome to just come off mute and speak. If not, it's fine. Kate.
We talked about as the facilitator, either teacher or facilitator of the session or event, it's kind of on us to assume neurodiversity in our audiences, and even if it hasn't been disclosed or maybe we don't know about it, really sort of building that practice in and embedding it within the event, and also like looking out for signs that someone may be struggling, and whether that is with any neurodiversity or any issue they may have, and really just being super aware of your audience and how one person's accommodation may impact another person's accommodation. So we talked about how some people may need a quieter session, and some people, so we were talking about teaching music, maybe for someone with an ADHD, they just really, really need to get stuck into it, and balancing those different needs. We talked about that quite a lot.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, that kind of like, cross-sectionality that is really, really present within neurodivergent people as well. And in terms of music, so I definitely find that there are additional needs that come within that. I play myself, but playing in front of people is really difficult. And how do you support those participants who might want to take part, but they absolutely find it impossible to play in front of other people? How does that happen? How do you make that work? It's really difficult to try and support different neurodivergent people within your kind of group when it's quite a big and different group. And then in terms of what you do once you've understood there's a need, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit there in terms of just kind of keeping an eye out and thinking about constantly, is there somebody that's working here that is feeling uncomfortable, and what can we do about it? So thank you for that. Was there another group, Danny, or was there just, there was another group. Is there anyone from the other group who would like to share your discussion? You can raise a hand on the thing or in person. No, that's okay. Feel free to drop anything in the chat as well. If there's anything that you discussed that you want to share and you prefer to put it in there, that's absolutely fine. So, in terms of the accommodations then, so why you need to act and where you pick this up from, the reason why we put accommodations in and why they make such a difference is because they can make the difference between an individual being able to take part in what you're delivering and just not being able to participate at all. And I really like this kind of screen from Chronic Resilience, which talks about why that is the case. So often we're just seeing, I've just said this question and they've been unable to participate and they've disappeared, or they've gone into shutdown, or they've had a meltdown. I don't understand. All I asked was this. you're not seeing is all the things that are going on behind the screen. So tight clothes, if you look at that first column, it's kind of giving you a picture of, so tight clothes are really difficult for a lot of people. Then you've got bright lights, strip lights, I just can't cope with them. Then if there's lots of different noises, which might not sound like a lot, but coming from lots of different places, somebody's not had something to eat that day, there's smells that are coming in, they didn't sleep very well, they need a break, they haven't had a break for a long time, people have been talking at them, or they've been getting to your venue, they don't understand what the task is that they're being asked to do because they've got all of those things behind. It's just too much. It's impossible for them to actually take in, what is this task that I need to do? Or even to be able to say, I don't understand. So having all of that build up makes it really difficult. So the more we can take away and the more we can make the environment really, really suitable for neurodivergent people from the start and anticipating that need, the easier it becomes for people to take part. So making sure that people have taken a break, that there's snacks or food available, that people can wear comfy clothes. Oh my goodness, it makes the world of difference. If you've got something that you're wearing that is scratchy or difficult, you can't concentrate on anything else at the same time. Making sure that the tasks are really clear. I've got a slide in a little bit that talks about how to chunk tasks and what to think about in terms of letting people know what they need to do and what it is you're looking for them to do. Making sure that people aren't wearing lots of strong perfume, making sure, like you said, that there's noise cancelling headphones, all of those kind of things. Make it so that you've got the screen column on the right where actually there can be a few of those things, but it now becomes a possibility to understand the question and participate rather than the first screen. So it's just bearing in mind why that is so difficult and why needing to recognise the need is there. And another reason of why you need to act, it makes the difference between somebody being in crisis and having significant mental health needs because of how difficult their environment is to being able to excel. And so in order to properly provide adjustments, you need to understand that individual's profile and think about what it is that you need to be putting into place for them. And if you're only going to be seeing them for a very short space of time, the more that you can put in place that is just happening anyway, the easier it will be when you're then talking to somebody saying, okay, so what is there an additional adjustment that we could put in? The easier that that's going to be. And when we talk about this risk to health, mental health and self-esteem, I kind of always looking at these reports that come through about children and young people's mental health and saying, what, so awful, what do we need to do about it? At the same time, seeing a real increased emphasis on children and young people's attendance within schools, and that we have mainstream schools that fit neurotypical children and some neurodivergent children, but often it's very difficult. And then SEND schools which fit children who have learning difficulties, but very rarely fit neurodivergent children who can access the curriculum, and nothing in between. And then we fit those neurodivergent children into places that just do not work for them. And as a result, we're looking at really serious mental health problems as a direct consequence. So we're always thinking about any of these things that we can remove, that we can make our environment much, much better, is really good. So understanding the following is really crucial. So processing speed. So I have a really slow processing speed, but I didn't know that until 5 or 6 years ago. So when questions come at me, I can kind of mask and kind of say what I think I need to say, but I'm not actually responding to the question. I'm not hearing it and understanding it properly. Whereas if I'm given the question in advance, or I understand what's going to happen in advance, I can then prepare myself and I'm much, much more ready for it. And that's the same for quite a lot of neurodivergent people. It's not that we are any less capable of answering the question or have any less relevant ideas to be able to give to that question or environment or whatever it might be. It's just it takes us longer to process the information. We're probably a lot quicker actually dealing with it afterwards. And then auditory processing, the stuff that's going on around us, the sound, the noises, like you say, some people need things to be louder, some people need things to be quieter. If you provide the opportunities and the ability for that to happen, either through headphones or noise cancelling headphones, you're starting to allow people to participate. I think what's difficult is when you put something like a quiet hour in. So you're saying, all the autistic people come to this quiet hour here. That's a nice thing. And you've thought about, where autistic people fit within your venue, but what you haven't done is thought about, well, how do we provide an equitable experience for autistic people? Well, because you could do that through making sure that the environment works and through making sure that you've got those auxiliary things in place for people. Then there's verbal and non-verbal learning issues. So how people take on the information that's coming towards them and how they need that, whether they need that verbally or written, whether the non-verbal cues, things like people's body language. I'm partially face blind. I don't read people's faces in the same way that neurotypical people do, so I don't always read cues in the same way. And sensory needs, things like we were talking about, the tight clothes, the smells, all of those different things. So important to be thinking about what might that issue be. And then how do we identify the needs and the things that you were talking about? It doesn't look the same for every neurodivergent person. And it can look like these things here. And often this is where neurodivergence is picked up, or more frequently ignored. And people are seen as, oh, they're just anxious, oh, they're badly behaved, or they can't attend, or they're, they seem like they're really clever, but they're not actually achieving, and people failing. And that's where the mental health issues start to occur, because actually this is unmet need. This isn't what it looks like. People's needs are not being met. And whilst this talks about, it's largely coming from what people see in schools, actually it's pretty similar to what you might see in a colleague who is not having their needs met. So it's really, really important to think, okay, I'm seeing this, but is that actually what's going on for that person? Or am I seeing an unmet need, and what do I need to think about that? So when we had that question earlier about how might you know, it might not always be as clear as you think it could be. So you've recognised there are needs. What's next? Sorry, just for a minute. Don't ignore it. Often that's what kind of the potential is. It's only going to be an hour session. We'll just leave it. It's best to kind of think about, okay, so there's an issue. What do I do about it? This next bit is don't assume it's a problem at home. It's largely addressed around kind of children that you might be working with longer term, where parents might be saying, well, what we're seeing is that there's, the child's really unhappy. And there's a temptation to say, oh, well, it's just something that's happening at home. But actually what's happening is the child's really unhappy in the day and is only comfortable to say and show that when they're in a safe space at night. And don't assume it's the individual's fault. When we go back to that social model of disability, what's happening to the individual is being placed upon them. And what we need to be starting to do is thinking about, what does the environment, what does the organisation do to change it? And don't assume that the person can't be neurodivergent because they don't look it, they're too sociable, they're too clever, all of those different things that you've probably heard people say, oh, well, you can't be ADHD or you can't be autistic because you do this. It's just not that simple. And do assume that there's every chance that somebody could be neurodivergent and act and look to seek help, because it's so important. And often, like you heard me say, I didn't know that I was until various other things happened that made me realize, oh, okay, that's what's going on. So people don't always know that they need those adjustments. So the more things you've got in place and the more things that can be there in advance will help more people. So what type of adjustments? So I wanted to kind of just give you, I've put 10 minutes, but I think just 5 minutes, if that's okay, Danny, in the same groups, just to talk about, okay, so you've identified there's a need, you've identified that you need to think about what the adjustments are, and you've talked a little bit of adjustments, but I want to get a bit more in the nitty gritty of, so what kind of adjustments might you put into place? Okay, so we've got a very quick 5 minutes for feedback. We were looking at the questions. We're going to carry on with the rest of the session and then do the questions right at the end, because I think some of it might get covered, and to make sure that if anyone needs to nip off, we've at least covered the content. I hope that's okay. Okay, so if anyone from the 2-3 groups, would like to feedback, otherwise I might pick on the people who did it last time.
Oh,
Go for it.
Okay, I'll do for my group. So I was thinking in terms of sometimes I train adults more, but if we plan our sessions, we do a lot online. We all will any session. So sometimes there's things where you're asking questions or you're hoping for a response. And if you're going to ask it, I was thinking you could send that out in advance so people had processing time before they've actually come to the session. And it's not just about what comes to their head in that moment, which I find very stressful. So I'm sure other people do actually. And then other people were saying, Martinate was saying that the pen reader would be such a simple thing because she works with a lot of parents who she was saying may say, oh, I haven't got my glasses, but it just might be like trying to read the form is too overwhelming, especially I think if you're having to work with any statutory agencies, the forms are enough to make anybody lose the will to live. Do you know what I mean? So they can be completely overwhelming. They're almost designed to make you give up. So I think things like that. And even somebody was saying that the money can often be an issue for small organisations, but I think you can make a start by getting something, isn't it? And then, and we were also then saying about there are access funds out there, but often people don't apply for them. They don't know they exist, or they feel like maybe there's a stigma to applying, but that we need to get over that kind of thing.
Oh, that is so important. That kind of, there's still that kind of stereotypical view about what it is to be neurodivergent, and it's still rooted in that kind of clinical deficit thing. And the more people who are out there saying, you think it looks like this, but look, it looks like so many different people. And it's absolutely fine to say, the more it will change. But yeah, we're still right at the start, I think, of that journey. That's brilliant. Yeah, great ideas. Thank you. Does anybody else want to share from the other groups? Feel free to just come off mute and start going if you do. Otherwise, we can carry on. It's fine.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Go for it.
We talked about how when we have bookings, we ask our teachers to declare, sounds awful, but just to state whether there's any additional needs within their classes and how we can accommodate those. So whether there's any mobility issues or anything like that, we have a lot of stairs in a lot of our buildings, is the nature of our buildings. That kind of thing, whether there's hearing loop needed or anything like that, just so that we can make adjustments to our sessions beforehand. We can change where we do things, we can change who leads, that kind of stuff, to make those adjustments before people come. And a lot of the time that bit of the form's not filled in, or it'll say, yes, we have one child who's autistic, but they will have one-to-one support. And that doesn't really help, because then we don't know if that child has sensory issues and we can't use the smell cubes, or it's that kind of limited information that means that our adjustments aren't then going to be good enough, if that makes sense. So we try to make adjustments to start with, but then it's like we try to make an effort.
You're trying to do it.
But we have a limit to how much we can do, because
it makes sense in more ways than you can possibly know. So I have two kids as well, and I was just saying one of them has an EOTAS package that's homeschooled, and the other one is on a school site but has one-to-one tutoring. We don't have to deal with schools anymore, and there are reasons why we don't have to do that anymore, and it's because there is a hierarchy of neurotypical, neurodivergent, and you're seeing that in terms of when you're asking the teachers to fill in the form. I don't think there's any malice or any misplaced wish within the teachers. I just think they are not recognizing what that is doing to neurodivergent kids' experience, both within the classroom and off-site, and what it does to them as humans as well, because it isn't just about what goes on in school. And there's a question in there about what do I think mainstream schools could be doing. And I was saying I could spend a day talking about what I think they should be doing, and still probably wouldn't go through it. So you're doing the right things. You can't be doing any more than that. And all you can be then doing is thinking about when that child's on site, what you can be supporting with, or when those children are on site. And it's for the education sector to be better supported in understanding how important this is, so that they're giving you that information. Okay, I'm going to carry on because I'm really, really conscious of time now. So the next little bit of the session is talking about the differences and some of those kind of adjustments in a lot more detail. So sensory differences sometimes just thought about in terms of, is it too noisy? Let's make sure that it's not too bright. But actually, there's loads of different sensory differences that affect neurodivergent people. And you've spoken about the smell. Absolutely. It can be overwhelming. Different places where people need to eat their food. You know, if you've got people coming on site to eat, is there somewhere that's quiet that is much, much better, that's not got the kind of smells that you get in terms of school canteens, because it's really difficult. Balance, taste, different kinds of things. Sometimes people are asked to taste and eat things. Oh my God, that's really difficult for a lot of neurodivergent people. And body awareness. So it's just giving you a bit of an idea that there's lots of different things to be thinking about in terms of what that sensory difference is that people have. And then the sensory adjustments and the types of things that you could put in place are many. And you've covered a lot of them while you've been talking about them. So the things like the use of headphones or ear defenders, making sure there's a quiet space, gentle background music can often be better than silence, being aware that there might be disturbing noises. They might not sound like disturbing noises, but things like a clock or a projector can be really, really difficult to deal with. Chairs screeching around on the floor, those kind of things, really difficult. Light, making sure that there are sunglasses, classroom spaces, calm, uncluttered, neutral. That's totally against what happens in most classrooms, but it is absolutely crucial. Strip lighting is really difficult, so making sure that there's access to lots of light. We've talked a little bit about the smell, touch, making sure that if there's anything that's like messy play or any of those kind of things, that there's an option not to do it, or to work with a partner, or to have gloves, different ways of being able to access that kind of experience, never forcing people to eat something they choose not to. There's a really good slide, and I was thinking earlier I might share this at some point or add it to this training, that shows a carrot cut into 10 different pieces, cut 10 different ways, and cheese cut 10 different ways. And each one of them, it says each one of these tastes different. And it does. Each one of those would taste different. But to neurotypical people, they might look at it and go, well, it's just carrot, it tastes the same. But it just doesn't. It just tastes different. And it's just being aware of that people, they might say it because they mean it, and sometimes it's really, really important to listen. And then just reminding people to eat and drink and have comfort breaks and allowing movement, asking neurodivergent kids to sit in a seat for a long period of time is a really difficult thing. And when you're talking about what could mainstream classes do, that is a fundamental thing. Getting people to make kids just sit in a chair is impossible. They need to be able to move around because they can't concentrate while they're thinking, I need to move my legs. So learning adjustments, again, all the anticipatory stuff, presuming competence. There's so many in diverse, and making sure that you're consulting. And I think I will get time to get onto the slide later about nothing about us without us. So consulting with autistic or other neurodivergent adults is crucial, because they've been there and they've had that experience, but they are so often ignored. And being very, very aware of neurotypical models not working for neurodivergent people. So things like growth mindset, resilience modeling, it just doesn't work. I mean, most neurodivergent people have to have growth mindset because they live in a neurotypical world. But what they don't need is that particular model of it. It's really difficult. And resilience, if ever there's a resilience activity that's happening, and unless there's a specific thing that says, and this is how we're going to approach this for neurodivergent people, I would be really, really, really skeptical that was going to be a healthy thing for a neurodivergent person to take part in. So all the different types of learning adjustments. So tech, there's loads of different ways of using tech. There's the C pens, which is like the reader pens, audio guides, visual guides. So like we talked about, just taking a phone even and recording what's going to happen, providing information in written form, but also maybe just like a 1 minute, this is what's going to happen, of you talking about it, using QR codes, so important. Things like application processes, they're so frequently very heavily written focused, but they don't have to be. And that's the same whether we're talking about a formal application process for a job or an application process for some kind of creative competition that kids have to participate in school. Every time I see it, it's very heavily written focused, and it doesn't think about how can neurodivergent kids access this? What else could we do? Could we ask them to record something as an audio file? Could we ask them to work with a mentor and the mentor records their words for them? How could we make this work so that they can still participate? If you're asking people to respond to something, sorry a minute. Give them examples of what you're looking for. What does good work look like? Teach note-taking. Note-taking is not something that is easy, and so often is expected that people will just know how to do it. Or provide tech that allows people to do that in a different way. There's so many good readers where you can write and it'll automatically turn it into a Word doc for you. Behaviour policies to reflect need. Yeah, naughty kids are usually kids who've got unmet needs. They're not. Generally, kids want to learn and do well. And there are lots of other things that are going on for kids that might not be because they're neurodivergent, but there is a hell of a lot of neurodivergent people and neurodivergent kids who are automatically assumed just to be naughty kids. Quiet spaces for assessments, using them every single time for assessments and making sure that that's a comfortable space for the person. Ensure that you're really clear with any lesson or anything that you're doing. The instructions are there and they're very, very easy to follow, and planning the reasonable adjustments for anything that's going to be totally new out of the blue or whole organisation activities. They're really, really overwhelming. Offering tech to support all the new kind of organisational skills and communication knowledge. How can you use tech to make sure that you know when you've got to go and do something, or when your next lesson is, or what you've got to do during that session? So important. Chunking information into manageable sections so that it's not like this big piece of information, but giving it at separate times, but just in chunks. Lots of printouts. Never, ever, ever ask people to copy from the board, ever. There's absolutely no need for it. I don't understand. That out of so many things has caused a lot of issues for me. It's not needed. We can provide it in different ways. It is absolutely not beneficial to a child. I apologise, there's a dog about to bark. I think I can hear him waking up. And providing visual information. So don't overcomplicate things. Make sure that you're backing it up with a visual. Audio information wherever possible. So you might have a lovely diagram, but if you're not explaining it and you're not verbally going through it, it might be too difficult. And in terms of things like mainstream, relating learning to interests is really, really important. Why am I doing this? Neurodivergent kids are really clever, they're really savvy, and they will often sit there thinking, I do not get why I am doing this. Whereas if it's related to interests, it makes a world of difference. And things on a coloured background for dyslexic people, if it's not on a coloured background, it can be really difficult. And different dyslexic people might prefer a different coloured background, but generally the kind of colour I'm using can be at least a benefit. So minimising anxiety, what kind of adjustments can you put in place? So always assume that just walking through the doors of your organisation or a school has been incredibly stressful just already. That's been very difficult. So anything that you can provide in advance to make that easier in terms of what's going to happen when they walk through those doors is brilliant. So any information, website stuff around walkthroughs, pictures of individuals or uniforms or anybody that somebody could come to for support, communicate any changes that might happen. So if suddenly something's going to be different to what you told a school, tell them and ask them to explain that to the child. Planning for leaving early if you're working in a kind of school or somewhere that's going to have lots of crowds, making sure that neurodivergent people aren't going to be having to move around in part of that. Key workers and one-to-ones. Plan for any off-school organisations activities very early, which is why when you were saying about we ask the schools, but they don't tell us. I mean, it's absolutely crucial that that's almost planned in at the beginning of a school year. We know we're going to have these visits. We know we're going to go to these places. Right, let's talk early to the place about what's going to happen, what we're going to find out, and how we can make sure that it's going to work for that child. That should be happening And schools should be doing that, as they hit under the Equality Act 2010 just as much as everybody else does. So they should be doing that. And you can be going to them if you know they're coming to you at the beginning, at some point during that year, and saying, right, we're planning for how we can support our neurodivergent children during this year. Can you tell us what needs you have at this moment in time? And I can tell you from a personal perspective, it makes the difference between that child being able to attend and not. And it's that important. And yeah, audiobooks are still books. I spent such a long time trying to get people to understand this. They are still books. They're still really valid. They still share so much information. And I think there's research out there now that demonstrates just how valid audiobooks are. So yeah, let kids use those as well as reading text. I know I've only got 3 minutes. I'm going to go as quick as I can. But yeah, so carrying on, reducing timetables or making things quieter, putting breaks in, making sure people don't have to queue for a long time for anything, safe spaces, so important. If it gets too much, where can I go that I know it's going to be okay and people aren't going to ask me questions? If people are in kind of a real overwhelm, don't ask them questions, give them space. It's like human nature to kind of go, are you okay? But it's just adding difficulty. Yeah, so processes to deal with things that might have happened in class or any kind of organizational stuff that you've got, so that you can kind of go, okay, so that happened, what are we going to do about it? What do we do next time to make sure it's different? And removing any activities that increase that anxiety. So in school, that might be assemblies, but in a place, in a cultural institution, it might be that there are things within your workshops or things within what you're going to do that you know are going to be really difficult for that child. And they don't need to happen. There's absolutely no benefit for that child for that to happen. Yeah, and a reminder that most neurodivergent people work on respect and not hierarchy. It's like there's like this kind of assumed, oh, well, I'm this, so therefore you're going to like do what I say, but actually that's not how it works for us. So finding support, consult with adult neurodivergent people, absolutely essential to anybody that's doing anything. You wouldn't do any work for any other minority community without that being essential premise, and it is exactly the same for neurodivergent people. Consult with neurodivergent-led local, regional and national organisations. There's quite a lot of different organisations that are out there. Always be wary if an organisation is not neurodivergent-led or doesn't have a really, really strong underpinning neurodivergent voice. If it's not neurodivergent-led but does have that strong underpinning voice, I think that's okay, because it's driven from lived experience. And then if you're working with employees and volunteers, there's the Access to Work scheme. You were talking earlier about, there's this stuff that people can go and help and get support with. And that helps with a lot of the assessment as well. We can always help. There's another organisation called Museum Disability Network. They have some brilliant resources and support that they can help with. For children and young people, there's organisation like the Specials Needs Jungle, but lots of other parent and young person led voices are getting out there a lot more now as well, and we can help with the children and young people's work too. And then I think that's it. So we've just about hit 11:30. So Danny, do you want me to just carry on with questions, or do you want to say something?
I think nothing from me, but Mel.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think maybe we'll just have a quick check back through those questions, if you like, Justine, and then I'll just wrap up at the end when you've had a look at what's in there.
That's brilliant. Okay, so anyone that needs to go, no problem at all. Just give me a shout if there's anything that we can help with or you want to chat through. And that includes anything to do with schools and how children access schools and mainstream schools, because, yeah, personal experience as well as what we do for Neurodiverse Museum. So what in particular do you think that mainstream schools could do better for neurodivergent individuals? Well, be a school that works for neurodivergent individuals, not a mainstream school. I mean, most neurodivergent individuals, or many, can access a mainstream curriculum in terms of the content and the academic requirement. The way that they need to access that is not how a mainstream school works, just from the experience that I've seen and the amount of parents that I work with. And I don't think until there's an understanding of what it is to be neurodivergent and what neurodivergent kids need, that's going to change. And that's from having taken schools to tribunals, local authorities to tribunals. I just don't see how at this moment in time that can shift. And SEND schools don't work for many neurodivergent kids because they don't have an academic curriculum. So there are so many children that are currently in a kind of limbo, either have behavioural issues, school refusal, which isn't refusal because there's not a choice in it, or are very, very unhappy within a mainstream or a SEND school. So I just think we need a total shift on what is neurodivergent, and then make sure that we underpin our education delivery with that. I just don't think that, I've had a mainstream school with an EHCP that was absolutely, nailed on, very specific. It would not ever work. They're just not the kind of beasts that can be shifted enough for neurodivergent kids, because they're not anticipating it from an educational perspective right at the start at policy level. And you can see that when you follow that through to like exams and GCSEs, the adjustments that are in place and the way that they work, and they do not fit neurodivergent kids. So if you want to ask me any more about that, I'm very happy to talk about it. And I'll try to stop about it now. So, okay. So the increase in mental health and school refusal is linked to the rigidness of education as young people. Yeah. When they're also adolescents. Oh, definitely. And that kind of like, everything's about rules, everything's about attendance. And actually, it's a really difficult time in young people's lives anyway. And then you've got these kind of like a whole thing about what if you miss 5 minutes, then you kind of life is over. It's just adding to the issues and the mental health kind of stress that is already going on, and is not helpful. It's not helpful for any child, but it's really not helpful for neurodivergent kids. So yeah, found a pocket of parents who can access, but then they've been failed by mainstream. Oh, and then sending them to independent school. Okay, so if ever you've got a child who can't access mainstream, there is a duty on the local authority after 15 days to ensure that they deliver education for that child. Local authorities ignore that on the whole. Disclaimer that I'm saying that because out of like personal experience, I've seen that that's what goes on. I'm sure some of them probably do listen to it, but most of them, from my experience, it doesn't kick in at 15 days that there is anything in place to be able to support that child. So at 15 days, there is a responsibility for the local authority to deliver education. So you go back to your local authority at that stage and say, okay, where's the education? Now, what should happen is if the child has an EHCP, an education healthcare plan, that child's education healthcare plan should be reviewed and looked at, and then the provision is supported. That provision might be a different setting, or it might be something like EOTAS education otherwise. So home education, potentially, but delivered through a budget that's supported by the local authority. Or it might be that the local authority says, actually, this small independent school is where meets need and they pay for it. There's a potential that could happen, and that does happen. What shouldn't happen is that is ignored. And what shouldn't happen is if the child doesn't have an EHCP, that they shouldn't be pushed through the process. At that stage, you're then looking at going for an assessment for an EHCP and education healthcare plan and seeing, because if the child can't access a school, then there's 2 tests to assess for an education healthcare plan. Does the child, or may the child have SEN, special educational needs, and may the child need a support through a plan? There's just those 2 tests. And if a child can't access a mainstream school for 15 days, then we're kind of saying then they meet that need to be assessed at least. So yeah, the amount of parents who are fighting so hard to try and ensure that their children can access education is huge. Yes. Also, yeah, Nicola. Yeah, give us a shout if you need anything. Oh yeah, cut carrots. Oh, it's good somebody else gets that. I do not like carrots. An example of resilience. So lots of schools do have resilience days, or they talk about resilience. And what they basically mean is, if something goes wrong, then what do you do to make sure that you can continue to participate or continue to carry on? But they're doing it from a neurotypical perspective. So they're never thinking about it in terms of what does that mean for a neurodivergent brain? So when they go to these trainings, they'll say things like, oh, right, well, if that happens, then what you have to do is just pick yourself up and then... Well, it's not that straightforward for neurodivergent people, because first of all, the reason why it went wrong probably wasn't to do with the individual. It was what was going on around them. So they don't have any control over it anyway. So I'm kind of like trying to say, unless that resilience training or whatever kind of thing it might be, that the school has got best interest in thinking this is really going to help our kids understand how to, develop as they get older. Yes, but you've got to consider what that means for a neurodivergent child. You can't just deliver it for neurotypical kids and think that it'll be okay, because it won't. And then I think, is that all of the questions? Let's have a look. I think that might be all of the questions. Oh no, here we go. Oh, okay, yeah, it's just somebody else sharing. Yeah, I mean, there are so many stories of neurodivergent kids who basically should have been supported when they were 4, who are still having to fight when they're in late teens. And actually somebody who works with us is in a very similar situation to that, where that happened. Because if you appear that you are academically able and there's no physical difference, there's an assumption that you just, everything's fine, but there's no recognition of what's going on behind the scene.
I think the problem is with that is, as well as if they're okay in school, so whatever. So my son, like in primary, was could get along because it worked, but obviously home was very challenging, should we say? And it was only, and they kept going, well, he's fine in school, go on a parenting course, and then you have that situation.
Oh!
Yeah. But then, like it was only when it affected school, because he's just stopped going, that then it's like, oh, we better,
Oh, I mean, they call it the Coke bottle effect. So basically being like shaken all throughout the day, and then the top comes off when they get home, because that's where they feel safe and okay to say, and just be themselves. And the thing around the parenting course is just unbelievable. I mean, if parents have children who melt down and show it in behaviour needs, that is often the first port of call, which is firstly blaming the parent for something that is absolutely not anything from their experience of what's going on. It's all coming from what's happening to the child at school. And then secondly, delays the support that the child gets for a further however long, at the same time as making the parent feel like, oh my God, have I done? Because when you start through the journey, you don't know about any of this. So you don't know, is it your fault? You don't know, is the reason why this is happening because of me? Or and you trust the schools and you trust the professionals because they've been here before, and it takes quite a long time before you kind of go, hang on. So totally get it. And that story is told again and again and again online by parents. There are lots of groups that are available for people, for any of us to join, that are there, that are lived experience voices saying this is why it doesn't work. And there's actually a group called Not Fine in School, because so many parents are told, oh, they're fine here. That the group has begun to kind of just go, no, actually they're not fine, and they're masking, and we need to stop that. So thank you so much everybody for your kind of participation in that. It was very useful. And I'm reading some of the other things in the comments that I wish it wasn't like this, and one day it won't be. And the reason why the Neurodiverse Museum was set up was specifically because a couple of us got so absolutely fed up with what was happening, and we're witnessing it within the cultural sector as well, and thinking actually museums and the cultural sector have got a real opportunity to shift this, to start talking about neurodivergent people in a different way, and start representing neurodivergent people in a different way. So we'll all do our little bit to try and shift it. Thank you.